The vertical jump is an important skill that sports such as football, volleyball, and basketball use. In these three sports, vertical jumping is necessary to get an advantage over other opponents. In football, vertical jumping can be used to catch the ball over other opponents, while in volleyball, vertical jumping could be used for spiking the ball, while in basketball, it is actually the most jumping intensive sport. In basketball, rebounding, shooting, dunking, and blocking shots are required to be continuously performed. Vertical jumping ability requires force and velocity to create the power movement. Strength is also required to produce the appropriate amount of force, while the velocity is needed for achieving the vertical travel distance. The first phase of the vertical jump is the preparatory phase. This phase is the event leading into the loading phase. Here, the athlete makes small adjustments to accommodate for the next phase. The adjustments include pointing the feet straight ahead, adjusting the feet for a shoulder width space in between, and preparing to lower the body. This is also the phase where the athlete can visualize themselves performing the jump. When proper conditions are met, the loading phase begins. The loading phase includes flexion in the hips, knees, and ankles. Also known as triple flexion, this is an important element for power development. In the Journal of Strength and Conditioning on Additional Eccentric Loading, it found that increasing tensile load and drop height improved the stretch and shortening cycle. In other words, increasing the rate of flexion in the loading phase could improve eccentric loading. Another key component to the loading phase is the counter movement depth, or how low the body shifts for loading. In the Journal of Human Kinematics on Control Strategy for Maximum Vertical Jumps, it compared the optimum versus the preferred counter movement depth. The comparison found that relatively short counter movement depth provided higher force and power output versus the optimal counter movement depth. This makes sense because a shorter counter movement depth can contract faster as opposed to a deeper counter movement depth. In the vertical jump, the arms are also involved with the hyperextension of the shoulders while the body is lowered. Hyperextension of the shoulders is what starts the arm swing. In the Journal of Human Kinematics on Effect of an Arm Swing on Counter Movement Vertical Jump Performance in Elite Volleyball Players, it found that the arm swing increased jump height. Once in a flexed position, the lifting or the propulsion phase can be initiated. In this phase, triple extension occurs. The knees and hips move into extension while the ankles are moving into plantar flexion. The arm swing is also initiated in this phase and moves into flexion. Swinging the arms before leaving the ground allows energy to be moved vertically, which allows more velocity to be added. It was also mentioned that the rate of flexion improved eccentric loading. The arm swing corresponds to the stretch shortening cycle phenomenon because the arms act like the end of a spring. With this phenomenon relating to a spring, the faster a spring is compressed and released, the more energy is translated into movement. This is associated with muscles and joints that get stretched and shortened. After creating enough force as a power movement, the flight phase follows after the lifting phase. In this stage, the body is not in contact with the ground and is relatively unstable. Once reaching the maximum height, appropriate landing should be prepared. Upon making contact with the ground, the landing phase is initiated. Sometimes landing is ignored due to its similarity with the loading phase. However, it is somewhat different due to the increased momentum. In other words, the body was never away from the ground prior to the loading phase, while the landing stage it was. The momentum from falling requires more eccentric deceleration. Safely landing requires the shock to be distributed softly. Just like squatting, the knees should be above the feet and behind the toes as it slowly bends to dissipate the shock. Do not allow the knees to move in a varus or valgus position as it bends. The follow-through movement of landing should allow the body to shift the weight backwards over the heels. The lower extremities aren't the only contributors to jumping. In fact, The entire body is utilized in the vertical jump for optimal performance and safety. Although there are multiple phases involved with the vertical jump, there are three main phases concerning muscle activation. These are the loading, lifting, and landing phases that occur in the sagittal plane. Here we have the muscle activation chart based off of the phase and the area of the body. As you can see in the chart, the loading phase mainly requires eccentric muscle actions, and this is to lengthen prime mover muscles such as the gluteus maximus and biceps femoris. This effectively creates the needed counter movement depth. While in the upper extremities, the concentric and eccentric contractions put the arms into hyperextension. Immediately after the loading phase, the lifting phase occurs. Prime mover muscles forcefully contract here. Key muscles include gastrocnemius, hip extensors that include the gluteus maximus and hamstrings, knee extensors such as the quadriceps, and muscles involved in plantar flexion. An important but overlooked movement in the lifting phase is the arm swing. From a hyperextended position, the arms move into a flexion above the head to decrease the force of gravity on the body. The timing is important when it comes to the arm swing. If the arms do not complete flexion before leaving the ground, the energy is wasted. Beginning the landing phase, the technique is critical in reducing the risk for injury. In this phase, it requires the greatest amount of eccentric deceleration. Muscles that cause dorsiflexion in the feet should be concentrically contracted before touching the ground. Then follows the eccentric contraction in the quadriceps and hip extensors. This is going to allow for the eccentric flexion that dissipates the shock. The arms are also put into eccentric deceleration while aiding balance. Getting the most out of the vertical jump is about technique and training. The proper jumping technique will offer the most efficient way of transferring energy for propulsion, while training will allow for increasing the amount of motor units available. Since the body is highly adaptive to the stresses placed upon it, progressive overload should be used for training. Examples of training for vertical jump performance can include plyometrics, resisted jump training, and weighted jump squats. Plyometric training uses stretch shortening cycle phenomenon, whereas the athlete is trained to react quickly and reduce the amount of time it takes to decelerate and produce power. While in resisted jump training, it involves the use of elastic bands that connects and pulls the athlete toward a platform. These elastic bands increase resistance against the concentric and eccentric phase of the jump. Regular jump squats are effective training methods on their own. However, adding weight to them only makes them better. A study on loaded jump squats in the Journal of Sports Science and Medicine found a significant increase in performance by the participants halfway through the 8-week study. With the amount of energy that needs to be stopped, the joints are put into higher risks for injury. Risks are even higher for those who do not utilize enough eccentric deceleration. There was a study conducted in the American Journal of Sports Medicine where 171 female basketball and floorball players participated in 3D motion analysis in jumping. This study concluded that landing with less knee flexion increased the risk for ACL injury within the young females studied. With such high risks, knee flexion and other eccentric actions are highly recommended. A journal on eccentric muscle contractions further supports this by concluding that, quote, while the high forces produced in muscles working eccentrically can certainly cause damage and injury, muscle and tendon appear very capable of adapting to such high forces if the muscle experiences this stimulus progressively and repeatedly, end quote. The vertical jump is a necessary skill for athletes to improve upon. In many sports, the ability to jump high gives the athlete a competitive advantage. Many people possess the ability to jump vertically. At the same time, many people lack the proper technique to perform the vertical jump safely and efficiently. To perform the jump with proper technique, vertical jumping can be broken into phases. Phases include the preparatory, loading, lifting, flight, and landing phases. The preparatory phase allows the jump to be controlled. The loading phase is when the body is lowered to allow the power development. Lifting is the concentric heavy phase in which muscles contract forcefully in a short period of time. The flight phase is when the feet leave the ground and the momentum is carried vertically. The landing phase happens last and begins when the feet touch the ground. Landing technique also has a large influence on the risk for injury. With such risks, jump training such as plyometric, loaded jump, and resisted jump training not only improves performance but decreases the risk for